Welcome to the CEC Report for the 29th of May 2015. I'm Elisa Barwick and with me today is Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, drumbeats for war in Asia Pacific grow louder, and Greece threatens default by 5th June deadline, world financial system on the brink. So firstly, drumbeats for war in Asia Pacific grow louder. Now on last week's show, you and Craig discussed the real build-up of wartime disinformation and propaganda, which is rather extraordinary at the moment in the build-up towards a potential World War III. And over the last week, we've seen, if it's possible, an increase on that propaganda, particularly around the threat of terrorism in Australia, terrorists that are based in Australia or coming back to Australia. We're also going to look at the escalation regarding the Asia Pacific vis-a-vis China. But firstly, on the terrorism and that threat on our own shores, this week we've had the Sydney siege inquest, which has created a lot of media publicity around the fear of terrorists. And also we've had the request by the wife of Khalid Sharoof and children to return home. Of course, this is the guy who's been over fighting with ISIS and whose child was famously photographed holding up the severed head of someone over there. So what's this build-up all about?
Well, what they're doing, especially the terror threat, is a manipulation of the public, and it's a transparent manipulation. So you've got the two things you've cited, plus you've got the government announcing a counter-terrorism czar, this bloke, Mr. Moriarty, Greg Moriarty, and then they took the Justice Minister and they gave him the extra title of the Counter-Terrorism Minister, right? And they've announced measures that they've copied straight from the United Kingdom of stripping people of citizenship, right, who they deem to be terrorists if they are dual citizens. And there's a fight about that because, you know, they wanted to actually have the right to strip anyone of all citizenship, but of course you can't render someone stateless, right? So there's been a kerfuffle over that. But of course it's been a constant theme in the news all week, and it's building on it was already building before that, right? But why it's a manipulation is what we said last week. So take this case we put him on the front page of our Australian Alert Service publication this week. It's horrific. So here you've got Khalid Sharoof. He's known to be mentally impaired, by the way, by the Australian authorities. So he's a not allowed to say this anymore. He's a retarded person in some respects. He goes over to fight with ISIS, takes his wife and kids over with him. Now his wife's Anglo, right? They go over with him. He's doing horrible stuff over there, absolutely horrible stuff, right? So he gets all over the papers. We want this guy back in the country. His kids, he makes them pose the ISIS flag and do these horrific things, hold up the severed heads of Syrian soldiers. But what our information showed last week, Elisa, is that when Tony Abbott stands there and pontificates about this, and I'm defending the Australian people from this threat, the Defence Intelligence Agency in 2012, August 2012, submitted reports to the White House saying that what we've done in Libya is now moving to Syria. We support what's happening in Syria because we want to use those jihadists that we used in Libya. We want to use them against Assad in Syria. So we're going to use them to conduct regime change. This is the opposition to Assad. This will turn into an Islamic state. That's what the document says. This will turn into an Islamic state, but that's a good thing. That's intentional because that will further undermine Assad, right? Because that is our goal, regime change against Assad. And at the time, by the way, in Libya, we knew Kevin Rudd was lobbying for Australian SAS to be sent over there to fight alongside these jihadists in Libya. We questioned in 2012 whether, as a follow-on from that, Australian SAS soldiers, because we knew British SAS soldiers were over there fighting alongside them in Syria. Tony Abbott has announced that it's now criminal. You can be stripped of your citizenship if you go overseas and fight alongside extremists. Yet that was the policy. That's what the description should have been for what our SAS was doing, or possibly did do, right? So this guy, this mentally impaired Australian nut job, as crazy as he is it's not, he could not possibly have done those atrocities unless our side, the Australian government's allies, and possibly with our involvement, we don't know, but the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all these countries that wanted to topple Assad, they created the circumstances for that to happen. They knew they were taking a dark age menace out of a genie bottle, right, to unleash it, to cause the most horrific chaos and genocide and crisis over there. They knew they were doing that, but they wanted this as their goal of regime change. And I just have to mention it because it's just to give people the bigger picture. You know, why the regime change? Why Libya? Why Syria? What are they doing? Well, look on a map, because all those countries, it's the underbelly of Eurasia. It's the underbelly of Russia. It's the and China's not that far away. It's the West messing in to create a jihadist uprising in their underbelly, ultimately aimed at them, right? That's why they're doing it. They wanted to do it. These guys want a war. And so that's the rubbish that Australians are being fed. We've been manipulated on this. This guy, Sharif, is not a threat to us. Our government is a threat to us by their participation in these imperial schemes.
And I just want to quote, for the audience's benefit and those particularly who didn't watch last week's show, one of those DIA documents that you cited that shows explicitly that these governments, like the United States, knew they were creating ISIS very explicitly. Now, this particular document has, in the previous section, been describing the US support for the opposition movements in Syria, the opposition to Assad, and how they want to bring Assad down.
Which we were told is called the Free Syrian Army, and they're moderates. That's what we were told.
So the document says, this creates the ideal atmosphere for AQI, which is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to return to its old pockets in Mosul and Ramadi, and will provide a renewed momentum under the presumption of unifying the jihad among Sunni, Iraqi and Syria and the rest of the Sunnis in the Arab world against what it considers one enemy, the dissenters. ISI could also declare an Islamic State through its union with other terrorist organisations in Iraq and Syria, which will create grave danger in regards to unifying Iraq and the protection of its territory.
And Ramadi fell this just in the last few weeks, Elisa, exactly as this said would happen. You know, and you had this other country, this other city, Palmyra, has also fallen as a result. And I made a mistake of doing a search for images on ISIS in Ramadi, and I didn't have Safe Search turned on. And it's just horrific what has occurred there. And this document from 2012 forecast it as a result of their policy.
It's deliberately been set up to happen that way. Now, what is interesting though, which we've discovered, is that the DIA did not have to release these documents, and it's interesting because it shows a pattern, and we've seen it with other elements like the renewal of the Patriot Act and the TPP, that there's a growing rebellion against Obama, even the fact that Kerry did go to Russia for the first time recently in 2 years. So there is a rebellion within military and other circles, and the DIA is actually immune from having to disclose any information under freedom of information or otherwise, whether it's classified or not, unless they are required to do so by the President or by the Congress, which is not what happened. This was a FOIA request by Judicial Watch, a civilian organisation. So we're going to stop there, and we'll come back and build upon what you said about how this is aimed at Eurasia in the next segment. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So we're talking about a new war build-up, and this time the centre stage is the Asia Pacific, and specifically China. Now, yesterday on news.com there was an article which quoted a tweet from US military analyst John Schindler, who reports the comment of an active non-American NATO official who told him this week, quote, "Probably be at war this summer. If we're lucky, it won't be nuclear," unquote. And of course, he'll be talking about the Northern Hemisphere summer, which is our winter.
It is now.
Now, we want to look at where this is coming from. Why all of a sudden are we talking about the threat of nuclear war so openly? And there's various other voices that have echoed that. He's not the only one.
Oh, and that was in news.com.au yesterday, like the main news website in Australia. Last night on The Project, which is, in between their jokes and celebrity interviews and whatever. In fact, their promo for the show, they opened with, "Are we going to world war?" And then they did a whole story on the build-up of a world war with against China.
Now, it's focused on the South China Sea, of course, and the background to it is that last week Obama had threatened that America would send warplanes and ships into the 12-mile territorial ring, which is the region which is administered by China and considered Chinese territory around these disputed Spratly Nancha Islands. And that seems to be moving forward, because what happened last week was that the US did a flyover of these islands in a Navy plane, a P-8A Poseidon, but also carrying for the first time civilians, which were media from the CNN and reportedly including an Australian.
So, in other words, this wasn't routine.
No.
Right? This was a stunt. They knew what was going to happen. They get the media on there, and then they do the stunt, and you see the results.
Exactly. And CNN recorded the interchanges because the Chinese Navy issued 8 warnings to the plane that it was approaching China's military alert zone and that they should leave immediately. So, of course, they've played those back over CNN and played it up big time. But the Chinese Foreign Ministry described this as provocative behaviour, and it truly is a provocation. Now, of course, you've got all this propaganda coming out about how China's building these artificial islands, so presumably this comes from the spying that took place, and that they're putting military installations on these islands. And that's part of the big build-up. The Chinese apparently claim that they want to develop this region and the islands as a navigation hub and a fishing hub. Now, in response to this, the build-up's quite dramatic, because Peng Guanqing, who's a specialist in military strategy at the PLA, the People's Liberation Army Academy of Military Science, told the Global Times, China will very likely strike back if the US comes within 12 miles of the island, adding that the US was deliberately provoking China. Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Russell, shot back later, nobody in their right mind is going to stop the US Navy from operating. That would not be a good step.
Yeah, Elisa, that quote, the last one you read there, that did hit my funny bone, because it did remind me. There's a funny, I'm sure it's a legend, it's a myth, but there's a funny joke that a lot of people have probably heard about a US Navy ship having a radio exchange with another vessel, what they assume is a vessel, where the vessel says to them, please change course, we're going to collide, and the US Navy ship says, no, you change course, and the other radio comes back, no, you change course, and the US ship goes, this is the USS Missouri, we're a big battleship, etc., you change course, and the reply is, well, we're a lighthouse on an island, it's your call. And it's this kind of, there's a certain mentality here that is on display, right? But when people take a step back, I recommend everyone put a map of the world on their wall, because you've got to look where these islands are. So if you look at just look at the islands, you think, oh, well, they're 1,000 miles from China, they're closer to Vietnam and whatever. But you take a step back and look at the world as a whole, they're a lot further away from the United States. But why is China doing this? People think it's offensive by China, when in fact it's defensive, because China knows that America is determined to hang on to its position as the world's #1 superpower. And what America would not hesitate to do if it was in a conflict with China is shut down the Malacca Straits. Now, the Malacca Straits is how China gets a lot of its energy in the form of oil, etc., from the Middle East. Now, China, as a country with 1.4 billion people, cannot afford to ever let that happen, right? And so it's got to, it knows that's America's move. It needs a move in that area, right, which is, after all, in its part of the world. It needs a move in that area that can be a defensive guard against that. And so it's a defensive action, not an offensive action, and the spin is being put on it by people who want this to blow up into something bigger.
And just to give you an insight into the US's attitude on this and the real baying for blood here, the Wall Street Journal had an article on the 26th of May called Russia, Iran and China are advancing as the US retreats. And I'll just quote you a paragraph where they say that China, Russia and Iran are taking advantage of American retreat to assert political and perhaps eventually military dominance over their corners of the globe. They share a goal of reducing US influence, bending neighbours to their political will, and ultimately using that regional base of power to diminish the global sway of Western democracies, especially the US. China, however, is the greatest threat. Perhaps the greatest long-term regional threat is a rising China with its rapid economic growth and desire to restore the Middle Kingdom to what its leaders see as their rightful dominance in East Asia. This is the typical kind of mentality that, these countries are building a threat towards the West, where if you look at all the pronouncements of China and look at their actions even more importantly, which speak louder than words, everything they're doing across the globe is this win-win idea, the mutual collaboration approach of helping uplift their neighbours. They've invited the US to join them in the Silk Road proposal.
And Elisa, America's decline is self-inflicted. When America let Wall Street and the City of London take over post-World War II, post the death of Roosevelt, and British free trade became America's doctrine, it destroyed the United States, destroyed it, right? The great United States is gone. Its infrastructure is in the toilet. It's collapsing. The only trump card it has over the rest of the world is more military spending than the whole of the rest of the world combined. $700 billion a year. That's the only dominance it has left, right? And the people who want to hang on to, you can't, if that's your only trump card, you've got to play that card, right? And here's China saying to them, look, we're not going to bow to you. We're growing stronger. We're not going to invade countries. We're not going to bow to you because you say we do. But let's work together on improving your economy, improve our economy, and they're rejecting that.
Now, we need to look, though, at Australia's role in this, because this whole discussion about the B-1 bombers, American B-1 bombers, which can deliver nuclear weapons, being placed in Australia is part of this whole build-up to some conflict in the South China Sea. Now, I want to play the clip of the Assistant Secretary of Defence from the United States, David Scheer, where he announced this, which was unexpected. So we'll just listen to that clip.
We will be moving significant numbers of Marines to Hawaii, Guam, and Australia. We will be placing additional Air Force assets in Australia as well, including B-1 bombers and surveillance aircraft. We are looking at further deployments in the Philippines on a rotational basis once we have implemented the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. So we will have a very strong presence, very strong continued posture throughout the region to back our commitments to our allies, to protect and work with our partners, and to continue ensuring peace and stability in the region, as well as back our diplomacy vis-a-vis China on the South China Sea.
Now that's crystal clear what he just said. No equivocation whatsoever.
And yet Tony Abbott, this was his response following a query from the Chinese Foreign Ministry. He said, I understand that the official misspoke and that the US does not have any plans to base those aircraft in Australia, and that our alliance with the US is not aimed at anyone.
Now that's total spin by Abbott, because there's no way that guy misspoke. And what's interesting about the way Abbott put that is that he characterised it as if it's entirely a US decision, right? I.e., we're just Australia, we have to do as we're told. That's the assumption behind the way his language there.
And it's also interesting that Scheer, after that clip that we saw, he went on to say that we are embarking on unprecedented trilateral cooperation to expand the reach of our alliance, which was a reference to Japan, the US and Australia. And for the first time this year, Japan is going to be included in the Talisman Sabre exercises that will take place, including 30,000 US and Australian troops. So there'll be a Japan contingent there too. Now, I want to quote also from Greg Austin. He's a professorial fellow with the East-West Institute in New York and a visiting professor at the University of New South Wales. And he just straight out asked the question, should Australia support US military operations out of its territory in the case of a military clash in the South China Sea or East China Sea? And that's really what Australians should be thinking about, because that's what's at stake. So we'll stop there and we'll come back and talk about the global financial crisis. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Greece threatens default by 5 June deadline, world financial system on the brink. Now, there's yet another deadline for the Greeks, which is coming up on the 5th of June. Across June, they have a total of 4 payments due worth $1.6 billion to the International Monetary Fund. Now, they've already stated outright that they will not pay the IMF if they don't have the money. And in fact, some Greek leaders, such as Deputy Foreign Minister Nikos Chountis, said that the IMF should not be paid even if they do have the money. So they're getting very feisty here. And of course, their red line is pensions, reinstating workers, reviving the economy is the top priority. Yep. And they will not accept a new loan or bailout if it requires them to
more onerous conditionalities, austerity.
Austerity, exactly. And at this stage, the Europeans and the Obama administration are continuing to pressure Greece to capitulate to their demands with a third bailout and continued genocidal austerity measures. Now, Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis lifted the stakes a bit this week when he said that if the IMF and the European Union do not come forward with a compromise on the Greek debt, this will lead to Greece leaving the euro, which would be catastrophic, he said, for both Greece and the European Monetary Union. He said, whatever some analysts are saying about firewalls, these firewalls won't last long once you put and infuse into people's minds, into investors' minds, that the Eurozone is not indivisible. It will only be a matter of time before the whole thing starts to unravel. And there's also, I might add, a push from within the Syriza party, which is the ruling party, to return to the drachma, to dump the euro, return to the drachma as a matter of sovereignty. But of course, the big concern is that this will trigger a euro crisis. There's already screams throughout the global press about the disappearance of liquidity in the bond markets, despite $13 trillion being pumped in since the GFC. And now there's a new push, which I'll get you to talk about, Robert, about simultaneous quantitative easing, new quantitative easing coming from the ECB, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan and the IMF to try to stop and forestall such a breakup of the euro, and discussion too about something called helicopter money.
Yep. Well, bear in mind, Varoufakis' comment, what he's saying is, listen, to the euro guys, you need us more than we need you. Because you think, okay, yeah, if the worst comes to worst, Greece can leave the euro and we're just like the gecko losing its tail. No, there'll be a whole unravelling. And the whole unravelling of the European Monetary Union will unravel the euro. And there's so much derivatives in that tied into that. Anyway, so here's the thing, that the Bank of England this week issued a report paper, an analysis thing called the World Financial System's Titanic problem, right? Where this analyst, Stephen King, made the point, look, with interest rates at record lows all around the world, right now we think, okay, there's problems, but you know, if there's the next crisis that comes along, ordinarily in a crisis, what central banks do is slash interest rates. There's nowhere to slash anymore, and that applies to Australia as well, right?
There's somewhere in negative territory in Europe already.
So he says if the ship runs aground, what are they going to do? And then he said, well, they might have to resort to what he called helicopter money, which is the idea, look, central banks have shown what they can do with quantitative easing. You print money and you give it to the banks. That hasn't worked. He said what they might have to do, and this is what no one wants to do, is print money and give it to the governments.
And they use the words injecting it directly into the veins of the economy by funding government spending.
Which they should have been doing all along, Elisa. That's what we call national banking. They should have been doing it all along. Back when Mario Draghi took over the European Central Bank in 2011, he loaned 500 billion euros to private banks at 1% interest, while Greece was paying 18% interest, right? And that's ridiculous. They should have been the other way around. And Greece could have been out of its problems now, but you've got to... The governments have to take back this sovereign control of their own credit.
But part of a good reaction to this is that across Europe you have calls for Europe to join the Silk Road and the new funding facilities as part of that. So thanks for tuning into the CEC Report. Join us again next week.